Hello guys, this is Panzer36, and today's video is going to be a build review of this Dragon Panzer 1 Ausf.A very early production. I ended up modifying the kit sadly to make it a little bit of a later production vehicle, but overall, this kit is very good to build. It's typical Dragon, a little bit complicated in some areas, a little bit hard to clean up some parts just because of the way they're molded on the sprues, but the actual kit itself is very small in the end, so the building process goes by pretty quick, and it was very enjoyable. Over the course of this video, I will show a couple of basic tips and tricks for cleaning up parts that are molded in difficult spots in the sprue and stuff like that. And also, if you're just curious about how I build a kit, this video will also show you all about that. As for the tools I'll be using, I have my basic Tamiya 123 cutters, a metal file which I much prefer over sanding sticks because it's much more fast and accurate in where I'm actually sanding on the part. I have a couple of knives, just different styles, box cutter style and a hobby craft knife style for just getting in different angles. For glue, I always use Tamiya Extra Thin Cement for the plastic parts, and then I used Gorilla Glue Gel Super Glue, which is the blue cap, for photo etch parts. I like it a lot because it actually doesn't dry immediately. You have about 10 seconds before it's fully set in, so you can actually get the part on the kit and move it around slightly and adjust it before it actually finally hardens in place. As usual, assembly begins with wheels here. The Tamiya 123 sprue cutters are very nice, so I can get it nice and close and cut them pretty flush. And of course, we do some final cleanup afterwards with the sanding files. As you can see, the metal files make quick work of the plastic. You can use sanding sticks if you want, the plasticky ones, but I don't find they're as quick in how fast that you kind of cut through the plastic and get it nice and smooth. The kit comes with these photo etch rings for the wheels, pre-cut and cleaned up for you. There's nothing you have to do with them. I just put some super glue on there and get them in place. They also provide you with some plastic ones with this kind of ring area molded on, but the photo etch I find looks nicer because it's much more in scale. The bogies were a little bit fiddly in the fact that they had lots of attachment points in kind of weird spots, and also quite a noticeable seam line over the entire edge all the way around. So, quick cleanup of the molding points with the file here, and then a lot of scraping with the hobby knife. I used the craft knife style here just because I like the angle better. And I'm just scraping away the molding lines on here. Just getting them nice and smooth because these bogies are pretty noticeable on the vehicle when it's all built up in the end. You'll notice that I use the hobby knife style of blade for doing stuff like this, but then I'll actually use the box cutter for cutting things like the photo etch later on. So here we're assembling the bogies together. They're pretty nice, they just kind of pop on. And the way I actually glue them on, this allowed the wheels to move around. So I didn't leave these separate, I actually just decided to leave the wheels removable and just kind of roll them around, which helped painting the tires later on. Now this is not very impressive, the way that they attach the sprue gates inside the drive sprockets here. Usually I prefer to be on the teeth, but the teeth are so small, the Panzer 1, I don't think it was really an option. So it was a little bit awkward cleanup here. Too small to get in there with the file, so we had to do some work with the hobby knife, cutting away the nubs here and just kind of scraping it down. Another less than impressive feature of this kit was the pin marks on the inside of the fire extinguisher here, at least the bracket for it. And the way I dealt with them, because they were sunken, was I just kind of thinned the entire part down up until the depth of the pin mark, which just got rid of them. You could always fill it and sand it flush, but I just kind of sanded the whole thing down, which got rid of the pin marks, as you can see. And it made the part look thinner and more in scale anyways. Also, the fire extinguisher here, once again you can see that some of the molding points are in a little bit awkward spots, mainly on the far left there between those two details. So once again, kind of have to get in there pretty close to the cutters, get rid of as much as you can, and then you have to work away with the hobby knife because you can't really get a file in there. In the end, it came out looking pretty okay, so I'm happy with that. And once again, kind of irritating molding points, mainly just the fact that this part is so small. It was very difficult to actually hold it to get the nub sanded down, so I'm having to kind of sand my fingers as well here with the file. But it's really hard to scrape something like that flush using a knife because it's such a big nub compared to the size of the part. So I'm kind of just holding it with my fingers here, trying to hold it without knocking it out with the file. Then rotating my fingers around to make sure I don't actually sand it flat. Here we have another unimpressive location of seam lines and molding points. You can see in between the bolts there. Luckily, my references of the vehicle I was doing didn't have the fenders on there, so I left them off. Now we're putting some details on the fenders here. This is just the tools and stuff like that. And you can also see the headlights in the front there. Location of the fire extinguisher wasn't too positive, but it just kind of sits in place there. The fenders do look very good in the end. I decided to glue the bogies onto the actual hull, not leaving them separate for painting. Mainly I just didn't really care. I figured that I'd be able to paint that nice enough. And the fact that the wheels can actually still spin within the bogies makes it easy enough to get in there and paint the rubber afterwards. Now we're putting on some components here of the hull, just like the front of the hull, the superstructure itself, and the engine deck. These all fit together very nicely. You can see little tabs in there which helps line up everything nice. And the engine deck itself, you kind of need to put the fenders and the rear armor on there first before you can line that up nicely. The armored plates that simulate the roof and the, the armor actually on top of the kind of superstructure component in the kit, they actually go on separately. And they didn't fit 100% well. You can see a little bit of gaps in where the weld lines are supposed to go. But you get a little bit extra thin on there and kind of squeeze them on. It didn't look too bad in the end. But there was a little bit of a gap there. But with a pin wash and everything like that, it shouldn't look too bad. At this point, I deviated from the instructions slightly and chose to use this piece instead of the one they give you specifically for this kit, which is over here. As you can see, the part that they give you has no viewport in the corner, and also this piece up here has a much wider transmission access port compared to the one that I chose. So the parts that I chose here with a narrower access port and the extra viewport are for a more kind of standard production Panzer I Ausf.A. Interestingly, the entire viewport assemblies, both the interior components, the kind of hinge mechanism, and the actual viewports themselves were all molded in clear plastic. Even though they are not clear, they are solid pieces of metal that have little holes in them for like looking through, and you can see that in the kit they're actually holes for the viewports. I don't know why they gave you clear parts for this, even though they are entirely solid in real life and in the kit. Alright, time for a quick trick on cleaning up seam lines. As you can see, this little pipe thingy has a lot of texture on it and a seam line. I'm not going to go in there with a hobby knife and scrape that down because it's going to ruin the texture. So I use some extra thin cement and just kind of rub over it in the direction of the molded on corrugated pattern, I guess you call it. And that actually helps to kind of melt down the seam line. And it works pretty well actually. Don't get too much cement on there, otherwise you're going to start to kind of melt the part itself. But if you get your extra thin cement brush in the cap there, moderately wet with cement, and just kind of rub it back and forth, you can really kind of cut down that seam line. It looks pretty good in the end there, as you can see. I also put on the horn here, which had a couple little locating pins there to help you line it up nicely. The antenna in the kit here is molded onto the sprue. It is quite thick, and cleaning up those attachment points would be quite painful, so I just cut it off. As you can see, I just cut it flush right here. And then I actually used some styrene rod that is 0.4 millimeter, and I just measured the same length as the part in the kit, glued it on, and it looks much more in scale, and there's no cleanup I have to do to the nubs attaching to it. In this kit, the exhausts are molded in halves. You have to put them together. So first of all, a little bit of cleanup to do on the rounded edges here where the nubs attach to the sprue. It's a very good idea when you're sanding down a part that is round like this to never hold the piece at the same angle. Always kind of shift the angle a little bit as you're sanding, otherwise you'll get a flat spot. Now to get rid of the seam we have on there, what I do is I wet the area with some extra thin cement, which will of course melt the plastic a little bit. And then I squeeze it together, and this will actually cause it to bubble up a little bit at the gap there as the parts mush together. And this acts as a little bit of filler. And then I just scrape this down with my hobby knife, and then do a little bit of cleanup with the file just to smooth out the edge a little bit more. And then we can get rid of that seam really easily without using any filler or anything like that. I use my box cutter style knife to cut the photo etch components from the fret here, just because it's an easier angle to cut with, I guess. And you'll notice that I'm cutting on a metal ruler. This just helps to get a nice clean cut really close to the piece so I don't have to do any cleanup afterwards. To get the rounded shape going, I decided to use the handle of a paintbrush that is a smaller diameter than the exhaust in the kit, because if you do this kind of rolling method, you'll never be able to get to the same diameter of the thing you're rolling around. As you can see at the end, it pops out a little bit wider. So pick something that is narrower than you actually want the final size to be. And then I use a pair of pliers here, very small, smooth-faced pliers, to do some final bending of the little edges in here. In the end, this was a little bit wider than it should have been, honestly, but it looked okay. Here I brush on some of that Gorilla Glue super glue on the inside of these brackets here, and then I kind of just line them up. It was a little bit tricky to get this all lined up properly, it's a little bit fiddly, but like I was saying, in the end it came out looking pretty alright. And of course, actually holding the photo etch part against the plastic piece it'll be on in the end helps to line up everything nicely. And here's the exhausts. They look pretty awesome. In the end, I did not glue them to the model. I left them separate because this would make it easier for me to do the weathering of the rusty effects on them later on. The individual magic tracks in this kit are very, very small, but luckily they're so small that they could not even manage to get pin marks on them. I'm still quite young, so these are pretty easy for me to work with and see, but I'm certain that some people might have difficulty just with the overall size of these things. They are very, very small. Now the way I assemble magic tracks here is I will put them up in little lengths of 5, because I find that if you make any more than 5, it'll start to fall apart. And then I will glue them together with Tamiya extra thin cement in the groups of 5, and then I will glue the groups of 5 together to make the overall length of track. And usually I won't do one length of track, I'll do it the bottom section, which is always flat. I'll do a top section, then kind of a couple more around the either wheel at the end. I know lots of people like to use slower drying types of glue. You can do that if you want, but I find that extra thin works perfectly fine with my method because I work pretty quick in gluing them all together in these little groups of 5. Here you can see that I already have a length of track on the bottom, which is flat and doesn't need to be curved or anything like that, so I just let it dry flat. And then I use a longer piece of track here, which will stretch from that bottom section around the dry sprocket and around over to somewhere along the idler wheel, the rear. This way, working in sections, the glue is still pretty wet, so I can get everything lined up nicely, and it's still able to be formed with that nice slack, which mimics the weight of the tracks. So I begin by just helping the tracks down a little bit more, and then I place some little, I think these are the plastic covers that I get when I buy paintbrushes at my art store. They just give you these covers over the paintbrushes to protect the bristles after they're purchased and in your bag. So I wedge these in there. You can use Q-tips as well, those work very well. And then I just stick them in there, and that helps to form the tracks to a nice saggy position. And then as the final length of track here, I count it as many more links as I need, and then I will finish off it here around the idler wheel. And then I always glue it into one big long length of track so I can pop it off and paint it separately later. And the reason why I do not do everything in one big length of track is because the instructions are always inaccurate in the number of tracks you need. Moving on to the turret, we have very similar components here in how the viewports are set up, all clear parts once again. So first off, we have a clear part here, which is sort of like the bracket around where the people look out. I don't know, it's just where there's little mounts there for the actual hinge assembly. These are all clear parts, so they're kind of brittle, hard to clean up, hard to sand down, and they don't seem to take extra thin cement as well as normal plastic does. Luckily, these parts here, the brackets, or the brackets and the hinge part here actually pop together. They have a little gap in them, so you can line them up nicely. As you can see, I left the ones on the sides here open, just for some interest. Then finally, I glue on the actual armored piece itself that goes on the top. The back of the armored plate here that goes on top, actually, as you can see, has little spots where you're supposed to line it up with the hinge piece. And since it's clear, you can actually see through it and make sure you've lined up nicely, which is pretty convenient. These parts here had a little seam line on them, and I found it to be easier to actually clean it up on the sprue, because the sprue attachment point is on the very rear of the part where it goes up against the turret. So I just scrape off the seam line using my hobby knife here, and then I cut it flush against the back because I don't need to do any sanding on the molding point, because it goes right up against the turret. I do love little tankettes like this. They're very small, they're very cute, but it's also quite a pain in how small some of the details can be. But at least they build it pretty quick because the overall tank is very small. The turret hatch is basically more than half of the turret itself here. It's pretty cool. The front of the turret goes on nicely here. It can be moved up and down. The actual kind of metlet itself can move, but sadly the hatches there, like the viewports in the front, can't be opened up in this model. The MG34s in the kit, actually these might be MG17s, I'm not sure. Maybe MG15s? Whatever, they look very good. The porting on them is nicely molded. There is no hole at the end there, really hollow, because the little muzzle is very, very small, but they do look very good. So I didn't buy any aftermarket ones for this kit. They slot into place very, very nicely in the holes here. Make sure you put the right one on the right side, because obviously one's a little farther back to help the loading of each one. And then the turret goes on top of the tank, and we are done. This kit was very fun to build. It built up very quickly, and it built up to a very nice model in the end. One more modification I'd like to point out is that I did add a weld seam, as you can see, the black line on the rear corner there, because it was missing a weld seam on that corner. Somebody pointed that out on Facebook, thank you very much. But apart from that and replacing the antenna with a styrene rod, I did no other modifications to this kit. And here's a little bit of a teaser of how it's going right now. I've done a little bit of painting on it. This will be covered in its own full weathering tutorial that'll have for you guys up in a couple weeks or so. As you can see right now, I've base painted it, done a little bit of chipping and stuff like that. And it's going to have a hairspray chipped desert camouflage on top of this, because obviously it's a German vehicle in North Africa. The markings that are on the tank right now, apart from the crosses did come in the kit, but the rest of the decals are things I've added myself. But the decals in the kit did work very, very well. So my overall thoughts of this kit are it was very fun to build. I definitely loved building it. One of the most fun things I've done in a while, because it was actually a pretty quick build, got out of the way pretty fast. The only issues I had with it were that really a couple of gaps are still a little bit present. You can see around the weld seams on the upper superstructure area. But when I give the model a pin wash layer, that should help to even out the contrasts around the weld seams, and also some more hairspray chipping and dusty effects and stuff like that. Just really help to cut down on how all that stands out. The photo etch for these covers on the exhaust was a little bit fiddly and hard to work with, but in the end it came out looking nicely. And apart from what I've just mentioned and a couple of kind of poor molding points on the sprues, the kit was flawless, and I definitely loved building it. It was a very good kit, and I do recommend it. This and any other Dragon similar Panzer 1 kit. So as always, guys, thank you very much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any questions or comments about the model or how I built it or anything like that, please post them in below. I'm always happy to see your questions and be able to answer them if I can. And we also have a great community down here. People are always answering their questions other people's questions, stuff like that in the comments, so it's always really good. And yeah, as I was saying, hope you enjoyed the video, and hope you're looking forward to the weathering video I have coming on this guy. Hopefully it'll be in a couple weeks or so. Shouldn't take too much longer to finish the weathering on this guy. And yes, huge thanks to the patrons who support me. We have Gary Wayne Bradford, Philip Kruger, Ricky from Ryan's Painting, Harry Ainsworth, Chris Corse, Ian Sistrick, Johnny Foxtrot, Richard Ward, John Butler, Sam Murphy, Jun Yi, and Rudolph Kiros, and of course Dr. Eo, who also supports me through PayPal. You guys are awesome. It's much appreciated. You guys will support me in my videos. It really helps me out buying kits and the weathering products that you see in my videos. Yep, so as I was saying, hope you're looking forward to the next video I have coming up on this one here. Should be pretty awesome, because you guys always like those hour-long weathering tutorials and stuff like that. And I'll see you then. Thanks for watching, guys, and goodbye.